Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name is 𝗏𝗏. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I am going to be talking about the times of the Gentiles that's mentioned in Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse. Many Christians believe that we today are living in the times of the Gentiles. Steve Gregg of the Narrow Path, for example, who's an amillennialist, by the way, he said in a debate with Don Preston of the Preterist Research Institute that the times of the Gentiles refers to, quote, the action of God saving Gentiles after AD 70, end quote. So Steve Gregg basically believes that God, for the last 2,000 years, ever since the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the year AD 70, has been primarily focusing on saving Gentiles as opposed to Jews. But one day at the end of time, God will judge the Gentiles too, just like he did the Jews back in AD 70. That's one view. Another prominent view is that, and this is a dispensational view, by the way, like Calvary Chapel, for example. So dispensationalists believe that the times of the Gentiles refers to the period of Gentile rule over Jerusalem and the land of Israel, which began at the Babylonian captivity back in around 600 BC and will last until the establishment of the millennial kingdom, where, Christ will literally rule over Israel and over Jerusalem, the whole area, not just parts of it as it is today. So basically both views say that we today are living in the times of the Gentiles. But is that really what Scripture teaches? I don't think so. In fact, as I'm going to show, the times of the Gentiles refers to the 3.5-year period that ended at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. Let me start out by reading the passage that talks about the times of the Gentiles. And that passage is from Luke, Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse. Jesus is talking in this passage, and here's what he said. By the way, Jesus said this in approximately the year AD 30, or AD 33, roughly. He said this during his earthly ministry. Actually, he gave the Olivet Discourse probably about a week before his crucifixion. So this was about 40 years prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. And here's what Jesus said during his earthly ministry. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon the people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. End quote. So again, this is Luke 21, verse 22 to 24. Okay, so like I said, this passage is, from the Olivet Discourse. The Olivet Discourse begins in Luke 21, verse 6, with Jesus saying that the temple would be destroyed. He said, not one stone would be left upon another. And then in verse 7, the disciples asked Jesus when this event would happen. And then in verses 8 to 19, Jesus mentions the various precursors, such as, false messiahs and persecution of Christians and famines, earthquakes, pestilence. Then in verse 20, Jesus said, quote, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near, end quote. Then in verse 24, Jesus said that Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Then in verse 27, Jesus said that the disciples would see Jesus coming on clouds of glory. And then right after this, Jesus said, quote, assuredly I say to you, this generation will be by no means pass away till all things take place, end quote. So this is verse 32, Luke 21, verse 32. So Jesus said all these things, including the destruction of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, the times of the Gentiles, Jesus coming on clouds of glory, would all happen within this generation. Keep in mind, a biblical generation refers to about 40 years. I mean, we can be sure of this by, we can look this up and you can read this in Hebrews 3 verse 8 to 10, or Numbers 14 verse 30 to 34, or Nehemiah 9 verse 21. So a biblical generation equates to around 40 years. So this means that all these events must have happened within about 40 years from when Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse. Remember, Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse in AD 30, right? So it must have happened by around AD 70, within his generation. And we know from historians that this event did happen, just like Jesus said. The city of Jerusalem and the temple were both destroyed by the Romans, the Gentiles, by the way, during the 3.5-year Jewish-Roman War, which began in the spring of AD 67 and culminated in September of AD 70 with the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. So historians all acknowledge that this event happened. So this is when Jerusalem was trampled by the Gentiles. This was the times of the Gentiles, by the way. And by the way, this is also when Jesus came on clouds of judgment. A lot of people get hung up on this, this kind of apocalyptic language where Jesus said he would come on clouds. Like he said in Luke 21, verse 27. A cloud coming refers to judgment, though. We can be sure of this because God the Father came on clouds many times in the Old Testament. You can read this in Isaiah 19 verse 1. You can also see this in Isaiah 13. You can also see it in Psalms 18 verse 7 to 17. So God the Father came on clouds many times. It refers to judgment. That's what Jesus was talking about too. And this judgment did happen exactly within a generation. Again, Jesus said that, that the temple and the city would be destroyed. He said that in AD 30. He said it would happen within a generation. Within a generation, it was destroyed. The temple and the city of Jerusalem were both destroyed by AD 70, just like Jesus said. So this was Jesus coming on clouds of judgment, basically. So this is when this was the times of the Gentiles, that 3.5-year period where the Romans or the Gentiles trampled down the city of Jerusalem. Another point I want to make is that this timing that Jesus gave in Luke 21 fits perfectly with the timing John gave in Revelation. And by the way, Revelation was written in approximately AD 65. So around 5 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. And here's what John said in Revelation 11, verse 1 to 2. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there, but leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles. They will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Then John goes on to say in chapter 22 that do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand. So John said that these events in Revelation, which includes what he's talking about in Revelation 11, which is that the city will be tread down by the Gentiles for 42 months. All these events were about to happen when Revelation was written. Okay, so now when we compare Revelation to Luke, to what Jesus said in Luke 21 in the Olivet Discourse, we see that both talk about the destruction of the temple, both talk about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, both talk about the treading down of the city of Jerusalem by the Gentiles. So this was clearly, both are talking about the same event. And the timing fits perfectly too. Again, Jesus said in AD 30 that it would happen within a generation, or by around the year AD 70. And Revelation, which was written about 5 years before AD 70, so it was written in approximately AD 65, said that these events were at hand, which means it was about to happen. So the timing fits perfectly in both of these descriptions. Notice also that Revelation said that this trampling down would last for 42 months, or 3.5 years. Let me read that passage again, or that part again. So it was in, that passage I read in Revelation 11, verse 1 to 2. The highlighted part, which you can read, which you can see on the screen, it says, and they will tread down the holy city underfoot for 42 months. So 42 months equals 3.5 years. So this 3.5 year length of time fits perfectly with the first Jewish-Roman War, which again began in the spring of 67 and culminated in September 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So this was the 42-month period in which the Gentiles tread down or trampled the city of Jerusalem and the temple. This was the times of the Gentiles as described in Luke 21. In fact, here's another confirmation of this. The Greek word 𝗵𝗠, which is translated treading down in Luke 21 verse 24, is a derivative of the Greek word pateo, which primarily means, and this is according to Strong's concordance, by the way, so this means to tread or trample underfoot. It conveys an action of walking or stepping on something, often with the implication of dominance or destruction, end quote. In other words, it refers to active military warfare, as Don Preston pointed out in his debate with Steve Gregg. So this definition fits perfectly with, the Romans treading down Jerusalem during the 3.5 year Jewish-Roman War of AD 67 to 70. So this was the time of the Gentiles. I want to mention something else about the Revelation passage. Some commentators say that Revelation was not written until AD 95, about 25 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. So they say that Revelation cannot possibly be talking about that event. I disagree with that view for a number of reasons. First, as I just pointed out, Revelation talks about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and then it said it would happen soon. So this timing fits perfectly with what ended up happening in AD 70. So that Revelation was written in AD 65 would fit perfectly with this. Secondly, this also matches perfectly with what Jesus said would happen in the Olivet Discourse in Luke 21, as I pointed out. Both talk about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and then both say that the Gentiles would tread down the holy city, and then both say it would happen within the same time period. Jesus said it would happen within a generation, and Revelation, written in AD 65, said it would happen soon, for the time is near. So both fit the timing perfectly. Another point I want to say is that no matter when Revelation was written, John said the events would happen soon, for the time is near. And while we have plenty of evidence that the events described in Revelation, like the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, happened soon after AD 65. There's zero evidence of anything like that happening soon after AD 95. So, if Revelation was written in 95, there was nothing that happened soon after that matches what Revelation talked about. By the way, I have an entire video about the dating of Revelation if you're interested. It's called The Dating of Revelation. I'll put a link to that video in the video notes below. Another objection I want to quickly talk about is that some commentators say that Revelation is not describing the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple that was standing when John was alive in AD 65. Rather, it's describing a vision. Just like in Ezekiel chapter 40 to 48, both Revelation and Ezekiel describe an angel measuring the temple. But Ezekiel is describing a vision. So therefore, Revelation must be describing a vision too, because they both talk about the same types of things. My response is this: I do agree that Revelation is referring to the same event described in Ezekiel 40 to 48. In fact, it's referring to the fulfillment of that event. The reason for measuring the temple was because it was about to be rebuilt. In other words, the physical temple in John's day was going to be destroyed and rebuilt or replaced with a spiritual temple and a spiritual New Jerusalem coming down from heaven. In fact, Revelation 20 talks about the city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven as a bride adorned for her husband. So this is referring to the church. The spiritual temple, spiritual New Jerusalem, aka the church, replaced the physical city and the physical temple that was destroyed in AD 70. So in this sense, I absolutely agree that Revelation is talking about the same thing as Ezekiel chapter 40 to 48. In fact, it was the fulfillment of this Ezekiel passage. For more information about this topic, by the way, I have a couple of videos you might want to check out. The first is called, Does the Bible Prophesy a Third Temple? And then the second video is called The New Jerusalem Fulfilled. I'll leave a link to both of those videos too in the video notes below. So if you're interested, check that out. Okay, so with that said, I think Revelation is clearly describing the events leading up to AD 70. This was when, the Gentiles tread down the holy city of Jerusalem for 42 months. This was the 3.5-year time period from AD 67 to AD 70 when the Gentiles tread down the city of Jerusalem. This was the times of the Gentiles, as Jesus talked about in Luke 21. So this not only fits the timing indicators in both Luke 21 and Revelation, but it also fits perfectly with what ended up happening in history, according to historians like Josephus and other historians. One last thing I want to mention, do not confuse the times of the Gentiles with the fullness of the Gentiles. The fullness of the Gentiles is referring to something completely different. In fact, that's what I'm going to talk about next week. So come back next week if you want to find out about the fullness of the Gentiles. Okay, so that is it for today. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do me a huge favor, hit the like button. Also, if you want to be notified of new videos, hit the subscribe button. For a more detailed discussion of the topics discussed in this video, get my book called The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled. I go over much more detail, about these topics. I also go over all kinds of other end times related topics, such as the new heaven and earth, the mark of the beast, the infamous 666 Antichrist. In fact, I have a whole chapter on the book of Revelation. So if you're interested in eschatology or know somebody who is, check out my book. It's available on Amazon. Also, I have a bunch of free articles and videos on the website, 𝗔𝗵𝗲 So you can check that out too if you're interested. Okay, so thanks again for watching this video, and I will see you next week.